Hi, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. You're here with Clocking In with Clara Mazza, labor and employment news for government contractors. I'm Sarah Nash, and I'm joined here by my colleague.
And I'm Sarah Strasser, an associate at Polaris Mazza.
Great, and we're really excited to have you here, Sarah. Today we're going to talk about a really complicated but fun area of labor and employment for government contractors, and that's OFCCP. So, Sarah, can you kind of give everyone who might not be familiar with OFCCP a little bit of an intro on, what this organization does, what this program does?
Yeah, absolutely. So hopefully no one's heard of the OFCCP and has never, had an opportunity to work with them. But, chances are if you're a federal contractor, you probably know who they are, or you soon will likely know who they are, because the OFCCP, which stands for the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, they are essentially an agency within the executive branch, within the Department of Labor, that is responsible for ensuring that federal contractors, right, so those who do business with the federal government, are taking affirmative action and are not discriminating against, a range of protected classes, including gender, race, sexual orientation, and so forth. So we hear, this a lot with regard to, for example, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, who's responsible for enforcing Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is sort of similar, right? Ensuring that there's no discrimination in the workplace against certain protected classes. The OFCCP is sort of a parallel agency, but responsible wholly for federal contractors. And they enforce three distinct laws, including Executive Order 11246, which covers sort of the gender and race and minorities categories. Also, Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act, which covers individuals with disabilities. And then the Vietnam era Readjustment Assistance Act, or VEVRA, which covers protected veterans. So within that sort of world, those are the three different laws that the OFCCP is responsible for enforcing. And obviously, they take various measures to ensure that federal contractors are in compliance with those three laws.
Great, thanks for that rundown. And in your practice, what have been some updates that you've seen coming out of OFCCP that you think are really worth paying attention to?
Sure, yeah. So I think, for a couple of years during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw not necessarily a slowdown, but sort of, as every agency and department, within the government was trying to sort of figure out what's going on. The OFCCP also had sort of, its issues as far as trying to enforce, right, and conduct audits and things like that. But with every new administration, there is also a new OFCCP director. So as soon as the Biden administration came in, the COVID-19 pandemic sort of, the restrictions started lifting and things like that. We've definitely seen a heightened enforcement sort of activity from the OFCCP. And among that, we've seen sort of a greater interest in pay equity, which we can talk a little bit about. They've made some changes to how they're running their audits, including making changes to what's called their scheduling letter, which is initially that first letter, right, or notice that you get that tells you, as a federal contractor, you are subject to an audit and you have to, turn over all these documents and do all these things as part of that. So they've made some proposed revisions to that, which is pretty big. And really just we're seeing sort of this new administration and there's a new director now. When the Biden administration first came on, there was a director that had sort of come straight from the EOC, which is that parallel agency that we talked about, Jenny Yang. She was very well versed in everything sort of non-discrimination and pay equity. She spearheaded the pay equity movement at the AEOC. She recently has resigned from her position as of the end of March, I believe it was. And so now the deputy director has now become the acting director. Her name is Michelle Hodges, or Hodge, not sure how to pronounce that, but she has a tremendous amount of experience within the agency. She has been, I believe, a former regional director for the Mid-Atlantic region, has sort of hopped around different regions. So she, we anticipate that she's going to come with a lot of experience and going to just pick right up where former Director Yang left off. And, she obviously has the experience, so she knows what she's doing. She's been in the OFCCP world for a long time, so we're going to probably see that continued enforcement activity continue, to take place. But beyond sort of the leadership change at the OFCCP, there's also all of these different activities that the OFCCP has taken that federal contractors should be aware of, especially as of last year, this year, and going into the coming years under this new administration. One being that for folks who may or may not be familiar, if you are a supply and service contractor with 50 or more employees and generally $50,000 or more in contract value, you are required to develop and maintain an affirmative action plan as part of your compliance measures. And that affirmative action plan, or AAP, used to always be a requirement, but you never sort of had any additional requirement on an annual basis, right? It was only maybe if you were subject to an audit that you would have to turn those AAP documents over. But as of last year, the OFCCP, pursuant to a directive that was issued in 2021, I believe, is requiring that all contractors, again, only supply and service contractors, certify on a portal online on the OFCCP website that they are in compliance with their affirmative action plan obligations. So the first sort of the inaugural certification happened last year at the end of June. And so all contractors had the obligation to ensure that they were certifying one way or the other, whether they were required to develop an AAP and went ahead and did it, right, and were compliant, or that they were not subject to the AAP requirement, and therefore, you would sort of click that you weren't subject to the requirement. And so that is happening on an annual basis. So again, the first one started last year. The second one now is happening. I believe we have a date of June 29th of this year. So if you're subject to the AAP, or if you are a federal contractor, you want to keep an eye out for that certification requirement. And obviously, if you have to develop an AAP and haven't, then you want to make sure that you get on it as soon as possible. And the other big thing, probably
a question about that, Sarah, before you move on to the next big, and I know everybody's dying to know now what that next big thing is. Spoiler alert. But what happens for those listeners out there who are saying, oh no, I missed last year's deadline? What does that mean? Can I do anything about it? Could you just give folks an understanding of, what missing the deadline, like what's the consequence?
Yeah, so, it's the OFCCP hasn't been 100%, straightforward as far as, what necessarily are the consequences. What we do know, though, is that they are using that data from the portal and apparently going to then craft their audit list based on that data. So, for example, if you are a contractor and you certified that you don't have your AAP ready to go, or that you just haven't certified at all, right? Like the OFCCP has sort of this database of all the contractors, then you would be subject to the audit list. Oh gosh, did my dad just walk in?
Totally fine. Let's roll with that.
Then you would be subject to the audit list. And then you could be sort of up for, right, an audit in the coming years. So there's nothing, the sort of recommendation and best practice advice that we can give contractors is, make sure if you know that you are required to develop an AAP, to make sure that you do, and you certify, right? And if you missed it last year, make sure you're on top of it this year. But know that if you do miss certain certifications, or if you did miss last year, that you could be on this quote unquote list of folks that could be subject to an OFCCP audit. And obviously, just really quickly for folks who may not be familiar with what an OFCCP audit looks like, I mean, that's basically just like any other audit, right? If you're subject to an IRS audit, God forbid, right? They're looking at every document and everything that you have to ensure that you're compliant. And so obviously it's a big deal, and no one ever wants to be subject to an OFCCP audit. So if you can avoid it by any means, then that would be obviously the best.
Thanks for running that down. And I interrupted you. You were about to go into the second big update from OFCCP.
Yeah, so the second one is this whole big topic of pay equity. So as I mentioned, the former director Yang was sort of very, very big on the pay equity movement at the EOC. And she sort of brought that energy with her to the OFCCP. And as soon as she sort of came on board, she issued this directive, right? Sort of these informational guides and outlines of what the OFCCP is going to do. They're not law by any means, but they're definitely the OFCCP and the auditors and investigators sort of use them like they're law. But essentially, she issued this directive that said that all contractors are required to develop an annual compensation analysis, which was nothing new. That's always been in the regulations. You're required to develop a compensation analysis and do sort of an audit of your pay practices to ensure that there are no disparities and so forth. But what sort of changed in this directive was that the OFCCP sort of gave itself the authority that they could retrieve that analyses from contractors, right? And that was sort of new, because at no point were you required to turn over your pay equity audit, again, unless you were subject to an OFCCP audit and they found some disparity or identified some issues, right, in your analyses. And at that point, they could maybe dig in some more and require you to turn over your audit. But there was never a requirement to do so sort of at any point, right? And that became sort of this new trend with the OFCCP, where similar to the AAP, they were requiring contractors to now sort of prove that they were being compliant, right? It was always in the regulations that you have to do these things, but never really a requirement to necessarily turn over things unless you were subject to an audit. So this obviously caused a lot of controversy and a lot of sort of commotion within the contractor and us attorneys, right, in our communities. And after sort of causing some ruckus and issuing some comments and so forth, they ended up revising that directive a few months later and essentially said, okay, we won't necessarily ask for your entire pay equity audit, especially those that are conducted under attorney-client privilege, right? And that was sort of the big deal, was a lot of our clients come to us, a lot of contractors go to counsel to sort of advise them on their pay equity audits and make sure that, they go through it and get some advice, figure out how to sort of remedy some of these disparities and things like that. And, the issue became, well, if this was being done under attorney-client privilege, then in no way, shape, or form could the OFCCP touch that. And so the OFCCP acknowledged that and essentially came back and said, okay, if you've done an audit or pay equity analysis for purposes of seeking legal advice, then obviously that, those portions of the analyses that were done under attorney-client privilege will remain protected. And, we don't have to see those. So, and really all you would need to provide to us is just verification that you did a pay equity audit. So generally they're recommending now like a statement, right, under oath, that you've done your pay equity audit, you've done it on this date, and sort of these like very basic pieces of information. And so still a big deal though, right? Because it was always just a requirement to do it, but now the OFCCP is trying to get information to make sure that contractors are actually doing it. And that's been one of the new sort of proposed changes in that scheduling letter that I talked about, which is sort of that initial audit letter that contractors get. Now, as part of these proposed changes to the new scheduling letter, they're asking for this compensation information, right? So again, it used to be that you didn't necessarily have to turn over that analysis or any sort of pay equity information unless they did a review and determined, after going through some documentation that there were some disparities and indicators. But now, as part of this revised scheduling letter that they're asking for, part of that initial request is going to be essentially verifying that you've done your pay equity analysis. So these proposed changes to the scheduling letter have been sort of going through, a notice and comment period. They were subject to, I think, public comment through the end of January of this year. We're expecting that final changes to the letter are going to be implemented really any day now. So, we should expect, with this new round of audits that we get later this year, that there's going to be a new scheduling letter that's going to be used by the OFCCP at that point. So, and it should be a much larger scope of information and documentation that the OFCCP is asking for.
Interesting. Well, I guess we'll have to invite you back to talk about those updates when we have them. I know that we're running out of time, but I had one last question to ask you. You had a quick answer. If you could give one piece of advice to contractors out there about OFCCP and, making sure that they're in compliance, what would that piece of advice be?
Yeah, I think the biggest tip I've given clients, and I can tell sort of the entire contractor community if they're listening out there, is just be proactive and make sure that you're doing all of these compliance obligations, right? So, and it starts with sort of maybe building a foundation or a checklist, right? A compliance checklist of sorts, right? Maybe assigning someone or a few people within the organization who are responsible for ensuring compliance, and then having a checklist and then running through that checklist on an annual basis and proactively ensuring that you're doing all of your analyses, you're having, your folks ready to get your AP together, and just making sure that you stay on top of this, because the last thing you want is to have the OFCCP knocking on your door, aka you're on that, wonderful list that's posted online every year that basically tells you, congrats, you're up for an audit. And the last thing you want, because there's a pretty short amount of time from that point on to then having to turn everything over to get all your documents ready to go, right? So as much as you can prepare and get things in order and be proactive, that's sort of the best piece of advice I can give.
Excellent advice. Well, thanks for joining in today. Thanks everyone for listening. We hope that you learned a lot about OFCCP and all of those fun updates that Sarah's been talking about. And we hope to see you next time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.